It's not structured the way a shir is usually structured, with its questions and you bring in sources. It's going to be more sort of going through a whole bunch of. It's going to be more like a whole bunch of little vorts strung together, all on the similar theme. I'm not a historian. I'm not Dean Eichler. You know, spent 40 years in Penn. You know, head of the Near Eastern Studies program. Whatever. He's probably one of the experts in the world. Doesn't get much higher than that academically, but this is just me as a kind of like just end user type. A number of years ago, it occurred to me, and from now till the end of the year, we're going to do a number of shiurim that relate to similar, that come from a similar place. But I realized what Dean Eichler said today, that if you understand the Near Eastern context, you understand the context in which people live, you understand many more things about the Torah that were not otherwise clear. I think I was talking to a few students today about a couple mitzvot. Were we talking about that today? And some of that is material that I'm going to be using in shiurim later on in the year. This applies to a lot of different things. It applies to some aspects of korbanot. It applies to aspects of some of the other laws in the Torah. The more one knows about the context in which the Torah was given, the time period in which it was given, the more one can understand how certain things were interpreted by the people then. So I spent a period of time about. It was the first year I was in Connecticut. That was when I did this. That's when I was really heavily into this topic. How long ago is that? 10 years ago? It's about 10 years ago? 2010. So 10 years ago? Oh my God. You know that? I'm just guessing. Okay, it was about 10 years ago. I spent, in that year, I did a lot of reading on Egyptology. A lot of reading about Egypt. I first identified through some of my reading that it's pretty much agreed upon at this point. It wasn't always, but it's agreed upon at this point that the time period of the slavery in Egypt of the people of Israel in the Exodus is the 18th and 19th dynasties.
Egyptian.
Yeah, the Egyptian dynasties, the 18th and 19th Egyptian dynasties is that time period, approximately. A little before, a little bit after, but that's the time period. And I started looking into what the gods were, the prevalent gods at the time, and learning about different things about Egypt. So this year is going to be a potpourri of different ideas that came out of that study. There's some areas, like as we go through the Makkot, I'm not going to go through every Makkah, because there's some that I didn't discover anything about, because, maybe if I did more research I would, but, or maybe it's just not enough material is known. In any event, I'm just going to share with you what I have. So the first thing I'd like to address is something that happened in last week's parsha. In last week's parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu, when he's at the burning bush, is given 3 signs that he's supposed to show Am Yisrael. Right? One of them is, the first one is he's supposed to take his staff and throw it on the ground and it turns into a snake. Then he picks it up again and it turns into a staff. The second sign is that he's supposed to put his hand into his bosom, it comes out leprous, and he puts it back in, it comes out clean. And then the third one, what was the third one?
Water with the blood.
Water turning into blood, but not water. It doesn't say, it says water of, that's the only one he doesn't test. Hashem makes him do the other 2 there, like he does like a practice run, before. It's like when you're learning a card trick, you don't want to do it to anyone before you practice in front of a mirror. So he doesn't have him do this trick though. Why? Because he doesn't say just throw water on the ground. He says, I want you to take water from the Nile and throw it on the ground and it'll turn into blood. Okay, so that one he can't practice out in the, in the hills near Midian or whatever it is. He can't practice there. So he doesn't practice that one. He goes to Mitzrayim. Now, the thing that caught my eye is that Chazal and Rashi, quoting Chazal, make a big deal out of what each of these signs symbolized to Am Yisrael. In the Medrash Rabbah, it brings this, that one of them symbolized that Moshe Rabbeinu was speaking, there's what they symbolized to Moshe, that Moshe is being rebuked for speaking Lashon Hara. We did the Rashi last week, Maza Bi'adecha, he spoke Lashon Hara about the Jewish people, that's what, and leprosy is what you get for speaking Lashon Hara, so that's leprosy, and also what they symbolize for Klal Yisrael. Okay, Rashi discusses in the Chumash what each of these things symbolize for Am Yisrael. What's peculiar, what I noticed one time about 10 years ago was that when God tells Moshe to go to Paro, he says to him, oh, by the way, the 3 signs that I told you to do for Am Yisrael, do them in front of Paro. So I sort of went, time out. But God doesn't feel like teaching him any more tricks. So, okay, you got to do miracles for Paro. Fine, do the same tricks. They'll work for that too. Is that what's going on? Like he's lazy? Do the same one? Because if the symbolism of them was symbolism that was designed to have an impact, a certain message for Am Yisrael about their plight, then that symbolism will be lost on Paro. It's a totally different symbolism. It's not about how God's going to save them and all these other things. And certainly the personal symbolism to Moshe about Lashon Hara. So it occurred to me, I wonder how Paro would interpret these. So obviously God says to Moshe, I want you to do this before Paro, so they're going to have a different meaning for Paro. Paro's not a Jew, he's not a Navi, he's not Moshe, he's Paro. Purely Egyptian context, Paro and his guys. How are they going to interpret these 3 symbols? Okay, so that's our first. This is the first module of this shir, is those 3 signs. So let's go through them one by one. The first one was Moshe's staff, which turned into a snake. And we know that with this particular one, the Mitzrayim also did it. They also had staffs that turned into snakes. It was the whole thing. And then Aaron's staff swallows up their staff. What exactly was this? So there was actually a thing in Egyptian mythology and Egyptian lore called a staff snake, believe it or not. There was a thing called a staff snake, and at probably the largest archaeological dig in the history of Egypt, and like all Egypt studies, like one of the major areas of study is this particular dig. It's called the Ramesseum. It's a massive, it was like a whole city basically that was found a few years ago. Tons of stuff in there, papyri and statuettes and parts of buildings intact. All kinds of stuff was found there. It's a treasure trove. And there were full, complete idols that were found, which is very unusual for stuffed animals. Usually they find pieces of things, they put them together. They actually found whole idols. And there are pictures of these idols that were symbols of sorcery. There was a picture of like a little sorceress wearing like one of these high Egyptian hats, holding snakes. Okay, it was the snake was a symbol of sorcery, and very often the little, what was the little statue called? I have it written down here. I have a lot of notes. I don't like reading from my notes, too much. So I don't want to. Here we go. A Sau, a S-A-U, is what is the magician, a female sorceress, a magician, and they found in the Ramesseum, they found them holding these snake wands in each hand. These snake wands, the staff snake, was a sign of magical power and protection in Egypt. It was like the symbol. So the sorcerer would be holding a staff snake. Now there are certain species of snakes that if you hold them at the right spot on the neck, they straighten up like a rod. Some people claim that that's what they had. They had these staff snakes. That, yeah?
It's not entirely clear that the animal which the staff was actually a snake.
A tanin. Okay, it was some sort of reptile. Okay, it could have been some other reptile that had the similar properties, whatever it was. But this reptile staff, I'm just pointing out that both in hieroglyphic paintings, not really hieroglyphic, but in these wall paintings, and in the actual statues that they found, the sign of sorcery is like this sorcerer is holding these snakes that are like these wands that look like snakes. Okay, it was a common symbol in Egypt. So to an Egyptian, the snake staff is the sign of magical power. So now the symbol, Aaron's staff swallowing up theirs, is a very obvious symbol. It's not just like his snakes swallow their snakes, it's his power is greater than their power. That's a very basic image. Now, the leprosy is interesting. there was a great British scholar of paganism named Sir James Fraser. James Fraser lived in England at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. He became a Lord, Sir James Fraser, and he wrote a monumental work. It's 17, 18 volumes called The Golden Bough. The full version, the full, like whatever it is, 18 volumes, you'll only find in like college libraries. If you go into Barnes & Noble and want to buy a copy of The Golden Bough, you could buy one, and it's the abridged version. It's about 800 pages long, 800, 900 pages long. He also wrote a few other books about paganism. One of them is a very interesting book called Folklore in the Old Testament. Very interesting book about all sorts of related paganism to the symbols in the Old Testament. That's much more similar to this kind of stuff Dean Eichler was doing. It's an old book. The Golden Bough was printed, I think, in around the turn of the century for the first time. It went through many printings before he died. And it's still a classic of ancient pagan religions today. And in it, in chapter 49, section 4, in chapter 49, James Fraser is discussing all sorts of... What he'll do is he'll go subject by subject. He'll take a subject and talk about how all different pagan sects dealt with that subject. So he's talking about the sin of eating a sacred animal. There are many different pagan sects around the world that had sacred animals that we're very familiar with. You know, like even still today in India, cows are sacred. So the crime of eating the sacred animal is like, you know, what's the nature of the crime, what's the nature of the punishment, whatever it is. So he's going through it. So in there, in chapter 49, section 4, he points out that according to the ancient Egyptians believed that leprosy affected a person who ate the sacred animal. Who ate a sacred animal. That was the punishment you got for eating a sacred animal. Now that's very interesting in light of the fact that that's precisely what Moshe is what the Jewish people are going to do. They're going to eat a sacred animal. And here's Moshe seemingly making, and this is just my interpretation at this point, you can go with your own interpretation, seemingly making a mockery of what causes leprosy. I have leprosy, I don't have leprosy, I have leprosy. But it's interesting, just in terms of what happens later in the story, that they're going to be eating a sacred animal, and leprosy is there. So that's how an Egyptian would interpret leprosy. Leprosy, the person violated the crime. He did the crime of eating the sacred animal. Now, of course, the Nile, I don't know if we have to even explain that, turning the Nile into blood, which is, of course, going to happen in large measure later. The Nile is a very powerful god. With this, we'll segue into the 10 plagues. So, take water from the Nile and turn it into blood. So, the Nile, there were actually many different gods associated with the Nile. The Nile wasn't a god only, meaning there was a god called Khnum, usually spelled in English Khnum, who was the guardian of the Nile. He's often represented as a human being with a ram's head. It's one of the most enduring images of Egyptian culture. Whenever you see like pictures of Egyptian gods, you'll often see this human with sort of like a man, but he's got a ram's head. That's Khnum. He's one of the most powerful Egyptian gods in all their mythology. So he's viewed as the guardian of the Nile. But the spirit of the Nile is a different god. That's a god called Hapi, Hapi, who's also the essence of the Nile. And Hapi is an older god than Khnum. It is more similar to those, and represented, they had a very similar idea to the Near Eastern stuff we hear today, of there being this primordial water that preceded everything, and that is Hapi. So Hapi, still, that primordial water, the Nile was believed to still be water from the original water that formed everything, represented by this god Hapi. So the guardian is Khnum. And then you have... There's a goddess of the river called Tauret, and then of course there's Ra, who is the sun god, who is born from the Nile, and then of course and then there's the very famous god Osiris, the god of the underworld. Well, the Nile, here's an interesting one. The Nile is Osiris's bloodstream. That's part of Egyptian mythology. And that's interesting, because the Nile is going to turn to blood now. And Osiris is the god of the underworld. So Osiris is a powerful god, but a sort of an evil god. Like he's the god, it's like the underworld where people go to get punished. So perhaps the Nile turning into blood might have carried some other symbolism for the Egyptians as well, that like some sort of rise of evil. Whatever it is, it's important for us to look at this because, like we say, "V'chol Elohei Mitzrayim Seh Shvatim," Hashem says, right? Hashem is going to deal with the gods of Egypt. So he's dealing with the gods of Egypt. That's what's happening with these 10 plagues. Yeah.
Do we think the Jews knew all this mythology?
They probably knew this stuff, even if they didn't believe it. The Jews did live separately in separate communities, and they were enslaved by the Egyptians. So it's not like they bought into Egyptian ideology. They were the slaves of them. What? They probably bought into some. They were raised by some of it. I mean, they were raised by it, and there were some Jews who were more powerful than others. Like it was a much more complicated.
They would have understood the symbolism.
They would definitely have understood the symbolism for sure. But they had their own ways and they were their own clan and their own sect. And again, they had their base elsewhere, in Goshen. So it's not clear what, they were definitely aware of these symbols. For the Egyptians, for sure, each one of these is an undoing or a slap in the face to one of their gods. So of course the Nile provides life, and now here it turns into blood, which is the greatest, strongest image and representation of death. Here's my favorite one: is frogs. This is my favorite one of all of the stuff that I discovered here with relation to the plagues. My favorite thing in the whole series. My favorite thing in the whole series is going to come at the end. Tony knows what I'm talking about. The frogs is really cool because when I was researching this stuff, and I was like, okay, I wonder what a frog represented in Egypt, right? So sure enough, the frog is a goddess. Okay, there was a frog goddess in Egypt, and the goddess's name was Hecht. It's usually spelled in English H-E-Q or H-E-K-T. Hecht is the wife of the creator of the world. She is the goddess that controls birth, reproduction. Okay? She represents reproduction. There were amulets and scarabs worn by Egyptian women to protect them during childbirth, and they would often bear the image of Hecht, a frog, for protection. They would wear these frog amulets to protect them during childbirth. Hecht was believed to assist women in childbirth. Now, think about the irony here. It Davka says by this Makkah that they're going to go into the beds. Into your bedroom. So what a weird thing to say. She's saying go in the houses. We need to know which room in the house they're in. Don't have that with any other Makkah. With this Makkah, Davka says that they went into the beds. So it's interesting that the frogs, which symbolized a protection, and they also was protection for childbirth and protection for the home, for the family. The women were very into this goddess because it was like their protection. So Davka says by this Makkah more than the others that it's in the house, it's in the ovens, in the bedrooms. If you think about that society, it's in the women's domain. And it's also where procreation takes place. That's where so Davka, like these Makkahs, they weren't just like it was always like slugging it up, as we say in Yiddish, the gods. So the frogs Davka are in their bedroom, and the whole thing is supposed to be a protection for the reproductive order. That's kind of a neat one. Now we understand why Davka frogs. So you sort of go like, of all things, like why did God just like hail, if the Torah hadn't been written, like, okay, we're gonna have godly plagues, like hail, blood, like frogs, like why not like caterpillars, like why frogs of all things? But now we understand it because the frog was actually a particular symbol. Now, what also I found it kind of interesting. There's a medrash, as with many midrashim. There are many midrashim that appear in multiple places. I've said this to you many, many times, and it's always kedai. If you're looking at a certain medrash, you find it interesting to try to look. You can use a CD-ROM or whatever, or use like the Masorah Midrash to look at different versions of the midrash, to see, I spoke about the Masoret HaMidrash in Torah Research Skills this week, about where you can cross-reference different versions of a Midrash, because sometimes you'll see slight changes in the Girsa, and then you get to pick the one you like best. So in the Masoret HaMidrash, so there's a Medrash. The concept of this Medrash is more famous. The concept is more famous than the content. The concept of the Medrash appears in many places. Is that each one of the Makot was Midah Keneged Midah, paying the Egyptians back for something they did to us. Right? We've heard this before. The Egyptians did this to us, so they got this. But the content of each Makot, people don't necessarily know what each one represented. What did the mitzvah make us do? For the frogs, how come they got frogs? What did they make us do that they should get frogs? So the Midrash says that they made us go around collecting all sorts of creepy crawly things. In one version of the Midrash, in what seems to be the most complete version, in the Midrash and in the Tanchuma, it also appears in the Yalkut Shimoni, the Midrash says that they made us go out to collect these creepy crawly things out in the hills, and that kept husband and wife from procreating. They kept us from having children because the men were out hunting frogs and creepy crawly things, and therefore they got frogs. So if you put that little detail, like not just that they had us collecting, but that they were trying to prevent us from procreating, it adds a little spice to this symbol. Okay. Now, lice is also a pretty cool one. This is interesting. Like lice is another one. It's sort of like what he's like itching powder. It's like all the like in the back of the comic books where they sell all these pranks. You know, like do they still do that nowadays? They sell pranks? No, I guess I'm dating myself. Okay. So lice. So there was a god called Geb, G-E-B, who was the god of the earth. Obviously, the lice came from the earth. This would have been an embarrassment to Geb. And the Egyptians gave offerings to Geb for the bounty of the soil, and it was from the dust of the soil that this plague originated. Now, why would it be such a slap in the face, Dafka, that it be lice? Here we go. In Herodotus, which is a very old historian, this is the kind of thing you want to trust old historians on. Herodotus was time of the Greeks. He was a historian of the earlier generations, and in his book, The Histories, on page 99, Herodotus writes as follows. Listen to this. He's talking about, this is Herodotus writing about the ancient Egyptian culture. The priests of Egypt shaved their bodies all over every other day to guard against the presence of lice or anything else equally unpleasant while they are about their religious duties. They bathe in cold water twice a day and twice every night and observe innumerable other ceremonies besides. The Egyptians they shaved they hated hair. They viewed hair as a terrible thing. They removed all the hair on their bodies. When you see those pictures, those Egyptian pictures of like people with like this like black hair that sort of goes like that hair was usually made of reeds that were painted black. They shaved their heads, their bodies, every hair on their bodies was shaved. They viewed hair as a bad thing because they were terrified. They viewed lice as a horrible, horrible thing, and it was almost like turned it into a religious thing. So the priests were totally bare of all hair, and part of the goal of this was to not have lice anywhere, because lice need hair to live. What in the pictures? So that might have been fake, or it might have been just grown out a certain way. But they had a lot of fake hair on them. Very often they had like again, when you see those pictures of like Egyptian women with like the black hair like that, it's not real hair. They shaved their bodies. They did not have any hair on their bodies. So it actually is a nace that they had lice at all, because you can't really have lice. People with If you're bald, you can't have lice. There's nowhere for them to live. Okay? Lice need hair. So it also is such a slap in the face of the Egyptians. They viewed it. I mean, for them, it was actually like it was like this horrible curse to have lice, and like it was to be avoided, and it was like a religious imperative to be clean and to not have lice. And here they got lice all over them. So there's another sort of poke in the eye to the Egyptians.
I forgot one thing about the frogs.
What about the frogs?
That they were left dead.
Oh yeah, that they were left dead. Yeah, that was. I mean, that added to the. What do you mean? Because it.
No, because it was like us to even to see one.
Oh right, yeah, right. That's right. Because frogs. I forgot to mention that. I actually have it here. Let me go back to the frogs. Thank you, Connie, for reminding me. Connie's heard all my shiurim. Frogs were so sacred in Egypt that even the involuntary slaughter of a frog was often punished with death. Forgot to mention that. You were not allowed to kill a frog. Okay? You could get the death penalty for killing a frog. Don't be surprised by that if you read the pagan books. There were some pagan cultures that if you cut down a tree, you got killed. There's some environmentalists who would have that done today. Anyway, imagine the people of the land as they went out to gather the decaying bodies of frogs. So imagine if you grow up in a culture where killing a frog is a capital offense, and you buy into the culture. You don't rebel against it. You don't think it's silly. You're like, that's part of your religion. So you see a dead frog, it's like, there's piles of dead frogs everywhere. It was just like, you see, it's demoralizing, and just to get ourselves into the cultural space. I mean, we're almost thinking about this in a kind of a cartoonish way because it's so bizarre to us. But we have to think this is real. This was real life and real. Like there are things for our religion that we would view shockingly that people outsiders would be like, what's the big deal? Like so you have to get ourselves into the headspace of these Egyptians. A dead frog to them was a horrible tragedy. The person who did it deserves to be killed. There are piles now of dead frogs everywhere. Okay, the country's covered in dead frogs. Okay, and the Jews understood the symbolism too. So the symbolism is very heavy. Now, the beasts of the field. Now this is Arov. I'm not doing every Makkah, but Arov. So far we're doing every Makkah. Arov. The Egyptians. Now I'm here quoting from a book called Moses and the Gods of Egypt. By a guy named John Davis. These are all academics. They studied. There's a lot of academic stuff, especially in the last 10 years. Some of the stuff, not all of this did I find 10 years ago, but in the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of stuff's been published on Egyptology and the 18th and 19th dynasties in relation to the Exodus. A lot of stuff. There's a guy Davis. There's a guy named Kitchen. It's actually his last name is Kitchen. I think John Kitchen or something like that. He's also an academic who wrote a book about the Exodus and the archaeology. It's very interesting stuff. Yes.
Is there any historical evidence for Yosef?
Yeah.
The coin?
Yeah. There's
The
stuff.
ring, signet?
Yeah. There's stuff. The Egyptians considered the following animals sacred. Okay, the lion, the ox, the ram, the wolf, the dog, the cat, the ibis, the vulture, the falcon, the hippopotamus. Very important god for them. The crocodile, also a very big one. The crocodile was a big one. The cobra, the dolphin. There's all sorts of varieties of fish. Some small animals, of course, including the frog, the scarab, the locust, other insects. Okay, so basically, they had all sorts of worship of animals. So this mixed multitude of animals that's attacking them, I'm not even going to go into what the symbolism might have been. Just the animal kingdom had turned itself on them. A lot of these animals were supposed to be protective in nature also, and now they're being attacked by them. Now, in terms of the livestock, now I'm going to quote from Herodotus again. This one on page 101, 2 pages later after the lice thing. All Egyptians use bulls and bull calves for sacrifice if they have passed the test for cleanness, but they're forbidden to sacrifice heifers on the ground that they are sacred to Isis. There was a very important god in Egypt called Apis. Apis was a bull. Had been worshipped in Egypt since around 3000 BC, which is about 1500 years. 1500 years? Yeah, before 1800, 1700 years before all of this is happening. He's already had been, the Apis bull was the living image of a certain god, Ptah. It's also associated with when the Apis bull died, the priests would travel. Then there was a bull called the Apis bull, and then it was like the pope of the livestock. It was alive. It was actually like an Apis bull was worshipped. Then it would die. Then they would have to go looking for a replacement, and they would have to find a black calf with certain patches on its neck and its back and its body, and that would become the new Apis bull, and it would have the power of prophecy. Now this could also lead to the Ega. The Jews had some of this nonsense in their heads, so when they were looking for a replacement for Moshe Rabbeinu, for something to bring down the word of God to them, now that Moshe is gone, that could be why they Dafka chose that species. Because of this nonsense in their head about the you got to find a young calf. You got to find a new apis bull. It's a young one, and it becomes a vehicle for prophecy. Could be that had a relationship to it. Although then why would they have made one out of gold? Why didn't they just take a live one? But whatever. I'm conjecturing here. Maybe. This is real stuff though. This happened. People lived this way. Now there was also a cowhead goddess of the desert, Hathor. Sometimes with a woman with a cow's head, sometimes represented as just a woman, some with horns, and sometimes just as a cow. Now Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of the desert, was also understood to be symbolically the mother of Pharaoh, even though Pharaoh actually had a biological mother, but is viewed in terms of the mythology as Pharaoh's mother. The king of Egypt was also often called the son of Hathor. And of course there was the ram god, Khnum, who we mentioned before, the guy with the ram head. So livestock also has a very important place in the pantheon of Egyptian gods. Now I'm just going to do a couple more. We'll do 4 more makot. Some makot I didn't know much about. The boils. No, this one's not so good. Forget the boils. I don't have anything on boils, except that this was the only makkah that actually was like an illness on their body. Everything else was something external that attacked them, right? The lice, the locusts, the blood is out there, the frogs. The boils is actually the only actual illness. Unless you call it Malka Bachora. It's kind of a bad illness. But like, boils are actually an illness, so there we could say there was a knock at Imhotep, who was in charge of Egyptian medicine, but I think that's a stretch. Because why Davka boils? Now hail is just an interesting thing because there's like virtually no precipitation in Egypt, ever. The area around Cairo, now they have plenty of water because of the Nile, but nothing falls out of the sky in Egypt. Okay? They receive, especially ice. The area around Cairo, which is the most fertile area of Egypt, receives about 2 inches of rain per year. Which technically would make it a desert, except that there's a river there. And there was, of course, Nut, the sky goddess, who would have been, that's who you'd pray to if the skies were not functioning properly. Yeah. There's a god of grain that would have, of course, been attacked with the locusts, Nepri, the god of grain, and Ermutet, the god of the crops, which is, I don't know why that's different than the god of grain, but I'm not a pagan, so I don't understand these things. Okay. Right, and darkness. So there was a moon god, right, and there was the sun god. There were the gods of the luminaries, who would, of course, have been obviated by darkness. So this is just a few things. Now, I wish I knew more, but the fact is that it's said very clearly in the Psukim, and it says not just Chazal, but in the Psukim, that God is refuting the gods of Egypt. The most interesting thing I discovered in all of my research, and it's also the most complete idea, and I hope you enjoy it, is find it enlightening, it has to do with Parshas Beshalach. So we're a few weeks away from it, but I'll share it with you in the context of this year. If we're here, if you have a chumash around, it would be kedai. You know those little chumashim that are over there? Can you just grab a few and give them out? Because here, if you see the psukim, it's like 10 times better. It really is. I promise you. And if you just please open to Shmot, Perek Yud Daled, Pasuk Aleph. Okay? Shmot Perek Yud Daled Pasuk Aleph. Okay? If you don't have a chumash, then you can just listen, but you'll appreciate it more if you have a text in front of you. Here we go. Am Yisrael has run away from Egypt. Okay? And it says that they were camped in Eitam. In the previous parak, it says that they were camped in Eitam at the edge of the desert. Now here, Perek Yudal Pasuk Aleph says as follows. Hashem says to Moshe, I'm going to say it in English. Speak to the people of Israel. Okay? Pasuk Bet, you got to pay attention to. It's a weird pasuk. One of these pasukim you probably read a bunch of times. You never really paid attention to what it's describing. Speak to the people of Israel. V'yashuvu. What does that mean? What does v'yashuvu mean? They should go back.
Return.
They should return. I wanted to go back. Okay, so the Jewish people have been traveling for 3 days away from Egypt. Okay? Perek Yudal. The Jewish people have traveled for 3 days away from Egypt. God now says to Moshe, tell the Jewish people to go back. So now they're going to start traveling towards Egypt. It's a detail of the whole Kriyat Yamsuf thing that we don't often remember. They actually started heading back towards Egypt. V'yashuvu. But then stop. V'yachanu, they should then camp lifnei pi hachirot, in front of pi hachirot. How would you translate that? The mouth of chirot. What's chirot? Chirot. What do you think the shorish of that word is? What does it mean? Freedom, chirut, or maybe it has, I don't know what it means. But go camp in front of pi hachirot. God wants them to camp there. And then, it doesn't just suffice with that. He says, Bein Migdol ubein hayam. I want you to camp in front of pi hachirot, between Migdol, whatever that is, and the sea. God lays out a very particular spot for them to stop and camp.
It says Piachirot is Piton.
Piton, fine. Lifnei Baal Tzafon. Okay? Even more detail. In front of Baal Tzafon. This is a very specific location. There's the sea, there's a place called Migdol, it's in front of Piachirot, and it's in front of Baal Tzafon. God says to Moshe, okay, head back and I want you to take Bnei Israel to that spot. And then, the pasuk could have ended there and we'd know exactly what to do. But, God, as though we didn't hear him the first time, says, Nichecho tachanu alayam. Opposite, how would you translate Nichecho? Opposite him, or opposite it. Opposite it, what's it? What's the last subject that was stated? What would it be referring to? Baal Tzafon. So opposite, or nochach means in front of, facing. Facing Baal Tzafon, you should camp al hayam, by the sea. So apparently Baal Tzafon was, I guess, facing the sea. Maybe there was an expanse of land between Baal Tzafon and the sea. We're supposed to be facing Baal Tzafon by the seashore in this very particular spot. And after God tells us where to go, he then says, in front of Baal Tzafon, camp there. He already told us in front of Baal Tzafon. The words right before, Nichecho tachanu, were Lifnei Baal Tzafon. So this is a stress in the pasuk. They were supposed to camp in front of Baal Tzafon. Now Rashi says on Lifnei Baal Tzafon, Hu nishar mikol Elohei Mitzrayim. This God remained from all the gods of Egypt. God had refuted all the gods of Egypt, except one. Baal Tzafon was the only one he hadn't refuted yet. Why? Ketela hatotan. In order to lead the Egyptians astray. Now you should know that Rashi's quoting a medrash as he is almost all the time. I'm pointing that out because Chazal were much closer to the ancient Egyptians than Rashi was. Rashi's closer to us than he is to the ancient Egyptians. Rashi's closer to us than he is to Chazal. Get that. Okay? So he said, in order to lead them astray, Sheyomru, that they will say, that the Egyptians will find out that the Jews are camped there, and they'll say, Kasher Yiratan alai v'alai. The fear of him is difficult, it's heavy for me and for you. Like, the Egyptians were scared of Baal Tzafon, the Jews are scared of Baal Tzafon. Fine, okay. Now, the next pasuk is, what happens in the next pasuk? It says, V'amar Paro livnei Yisrael. Now here, it's important to note, this is not Paro talking in this next pasuk. It's God still talking to Moshe, telling him what's going to happen. He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back, and I want you to camp in that particular spot in front of Piachirot, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Tzafon, facing Baal Tzafon. I want you to camp there. Take the Jewish people, go stop there. Now, what's going to happen next, this is still God talking in Pasuk Gimel, and Paro is going to say, Livnei Yisrael, meaning about the Jewish people. Nivuchim heim ba'aretz. What does nivuchim mean? Translate the word nivuchim. Anyone know what the word means? Perplexed. You know that from the title of the famous book, Moreh Nevuchim, by the Rambam, which translates as God for the perplexed. Rashi messes around with the word nivuchim to translate it, and what I'm gonna say is gonna disagree with Rashi. But nivuchim, Rashi says, means kiluim, means which means imprisoned. But we all know that that's not what the word nivuchim means. Rashi justifies it, and he brings an old French word. Rashi's working really hard to say that that's what it means. Okay? I'm not the only one who's called like on Rashi. I wouldn't do this by myself. Who am I? The Targum Yonatan ben Uziel has a different shot also, so I'm going to go with him. He's older than Rashi. Okay. Nivuchim hem ba'aretz. Let's go with what we know about the word nivuchim. They're perplexed in the land. That's a very weird thing to say about the Jewish people because they're camped at that spot. They're confused. They're perplexed. And now the next phrase is also difficult to translate. Sagar aleihem hamidbar. How do you translate that? The desert is closing on them. Or he closed the desert on them. The most direct translation is he closed the desert on them. Okay? And then why did I say that it was still God talking? Because the next pasuk is a continuation. And I will harden Paro's heart. He's going to run after you. And And one of the big questions we always have when we read this is, okay, God's hardening his heart, but come on. What the Egyptians, all these Egyptians who are going with Pharaoh, are they nuts? They've just been whacked with 10 makot, including makat b'chorot. And are they gluttons for punishment? They're chasing after the Jewish people? What were they thinking? Right? When you read the story, you're just wondering, like, oh my. I mean, it's almost comical at this point that the Egyptians are running after the Jews. Don't do it! Like, have you not been paying attention? So, what does this pasuk mean? Now, Michael, could you pull out the Hama'or Shmot and pass it over to me while I start talking about this? Okay, is that a Ma'or Shmot? So pass it to me. I just need one with Targum Yonatan ben Uziel. Okay? Now, here's the thing. How would you translate Baal Tzafon? Master of the North. Well, it just so happens that I discovered that in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was in one of the most ancient Egyptian texts, it's an Egyptian text that is the most authoritative text about Egyptian mythology, about Egyptian gods, written then, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There is a god mentioned in the Egyptian Book of the Dead whose name was the Lord of the Northern Sky. Almost an exact translation of Baal Tzafon. Okay? And according to the great Egyptologist from Germany, Heinrich Brugsch, the famous Egyptologist, if there's such a thing as a famous Egyptologist, he says that it's most likely that this is the same God because he fits the description. Why? Let me tell you about this God. The Lord of the Northern Sky was his title. But that wasn't his name. In Egyptian mythology, there's very often a title and a name. His name was Set. Okay? Set is a pretty well-known Egyptian god. Set is a pretty interesting Egyptian god because in the early dynasties, in the Egyptian mythology, Set killed his brother Horus. Okay? And as a result, he was banished. Banished to the desert. He was a rebel. He was a wild guy. Killed his brother. He's like this evil god gone astray, who's kicked out. And for many dynasties, he was viewed as just this evil god who lived out in the desert and caused storms and caused chaos and was just this chaotic, wild, evil god. And that if you ran out into the desert, if people ran out in the desert and got lost there or went crazy there or died there, it was because Set got them. Okay? Now, in the 18th and 19th dynasties, and this is not Torah, this is just the Egypt history, the history of their beliefs. In the 18th and 19th dynasties, Set became a very popular god. Whereas for many years, Set had fallen. No one really worshipped Set. He was just this like evil god you wanted to avoid. He became a popular god that was worshipped by the pharaohs during those two dynasties. Why? Because those two dynasties were the the peak of when Egypt was enslaving people from all over the world. The Jews were not the only slaves in Egypt. There were lots of slaves from other nations. Yes?
Could that have been what Paro thought Moshe meant by going into the desert and worshipping for 3 days?
That he was going to be worshiping Set?
Yeah.
No. No. You'll see why in a moment. There's no way. Because, what?
I was looking to get the answer.
No, that's not what he meant. You'll see why in a moment. So because they had a lot of slaves, Seth became viewed differently. During the 18th and 19th dynasties, this god, he became viewed as the one who prevented slaves from escaping. You see, obviously, if you have lots of slaves, you want to discourage the slaves from escaping. So they would basically say to the slaves, if you run out to the desert, Seth's going to get you. Okay? So Set became viewed as the god of chaos and storms and the desert, okay, who also prevented slaves from escaping and was responsible for storms at sea, because one of the ways to escape from Egypt was to go out on a boat to try to cross the water. So he would be responsible for storms at sea, and he was the one who would prevent slaves from escaping. Okay? That was his role. The Targum Yonatan ben Uziel, which, like I said, is way older. He's from the era of the Tanaim. We're talking way closer to ancient Egypt than any Perushim we would have at our disposal. Listen to how he translates the pasuk. He tells them where to. He says, Hashem tells Moshe, tell them to travel, okay, between Migdal and the Yam, in front of Ta'avat Safon, in front of the god Safon, the Mishtar Mikoltav and the Mitzrayim, who was left from all the gods of Egypt. That's where Rashi got it from. Begin the Yemnu Mitzray, Bachiru Baal Safon Mikoltav, because the Egyptians would say, Baal Safon is the choicest, he's the most powerful of all the gods, the Ishtar, Velo Laka, and he hasn't been refuted yet. What he does hasn't been undone by anything that's happened yet. V'yetum lemizgudlei, v'yishkechun yadchon, v'da'atun sharon l'kivlei al gefya. Okay. V'yemar paro l'datan v'avira. Okay, then he throw in datan v'aviram here. That's a different shir one day. And Paro would say to Datan and Aviram, forget them. B'nei Yisrael, the Mishtarim and Mitzrayim, mitarfin hinun. Here we go. How did he translate nevuchim hem ba'aretz? Rashi said, enclosed. Mitarfin. What is mituraf? Crazy. They've gone nuts. They're confused. Chaos. Set's got them. That's why that funny word. They're heading back towards us. They're stuck. Set's got them. They can't escape. Slaves trying to escape in the desert, heading the wrong way. They're confused. Set's got them. Mitarfininu and Amma Beit Yisrael. Ba'ara. Sagar alehem hamidbar. How does he translate that? Tarat aleon tavat safon nagdid madbra. The god Safon, the lord of the desert, has closed the desert on them. He's got them. He's caught them. So now, that's who Baal Safon was. Fits the perfect description for what's happening here. He lives outside the land of Egypt, at the edge, where the slaves run to escape. That's our scene. Lots of slaves. Okay? He confuses people. He causes chaos. He causes storms. Storms at sea that prevent slaves from escaping. So what does God do? The ultimate refutation of a God. God could have split the sea anyway. Davka says that he had a wind blow. Turned into a storm. Okay? And where does the wind blow from? Right? Ruach Kadim. So there's this wind blowing in off the water. It's a storm at sea that allows slaves to escape. It's beautiful. We're going to create a storm at sea that the whole function of the storm is going to be to allow the slaves to escape. Brilliant. It's the ultimate refutation of the god Baal Safon. Okay? So I want you to camp out right in front of that god. Not that, oh, maybe he didn't get us because we weren't near his temple. No, you're going to camp out right in front of him, and right in front of Baal Zephon, there's going to be a storm, which is going to allow the slaves to escape. Then, Baal Zephon will have been refuted. Okay? That's, I think that's a nice, works well. Yeah, beautiful. Okay, anyway, so that's the shiur for tonight. Just going through different things. I didn't answer everything, and not everything was as airtight as everything else. I think the frogs and the lights were probably like better than maybe the explanation of boils. But you see that obviously there's much more that we could learn. There's much going on beneath the surface, and just also to get into the heads of Am Yisrael, they knew what was going on. They got all this, and the Egyptians. And lest we think that it doesn't matter what the Egyptians think, it matters a whole lot what they think. Hashem says over and over again that the purpose of the Makot, God could have saved Am Yisrael with one Makot. The purpose of the Makot is stated in the Torah a couple of times. V'yad'u Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem. That's the stated purpose of the Makot, that the Egyptians should know that I am God. So the only way for the Egyptians to know that I am God, the Makot have to speak. It's actually more important that it speak the Egyptians' language than speak the Jews' language. What the Jews got out of it is less important. It had to be a message to the Egyptians, and for it to be a message, for us to understand what that message was, we need to understand the context in which the Egyptians thought about these various symbols. So.